And I want to find out if you all know what the movement is or what you think it is. And then I want to tell you what I think it is. Then I want to define the civil rights movement as a particular movement. And in defining it, I want to talk about strategy and tactics of the civil rights movement, things that I personally was involved in, things that I know about and I can give you firsthand information on. Then I want to tell you what I think were the key developments of the movement. There were specific kinds of happenings or incidents or whatever that I think were really important. Then I want to make sure that you know the 5 mainline civil rights organizations. I want to tell you what they are, when they got developed, who was important to develop them, and what is their social program. And then the final thing I want to talk about is the Black Power movement, which was related to the civil rights movement, but not exactly the same. And it's in the context of the Black Power movement that the Panther Party and people like Ben Chavis would come up. It just so happens that Ben and I are friends and I know him very well. But you know, Ben and Angela Davis and all of them, they come into another part of the movement that I would not call the civil rights movement. So I want to make the distinction, but I ultimately want to talk about those people. And in the process of all of this, I want to talk about any body or anything that you have heard about or somebody vaguely mentioned to you or you got some questions about. We want to try to handle those questions. So that's what I'm going to try to do. Okay. And like I said, it's up to you. You can take notes, you can go to sleep, you can do whatever. But I'm going to try to give you something that I think will help you in terms of understanding all of this. And you know, you can decide whether or not it's useful. So, are there any questions about that? About you know what I'm going to try to do or anything? Okay, so I sent to get this one-page design of the course, the stuff that I just went over, to have a copy and give out to you. The next time we meet, I'm going to try and have a copy of the poverty program for you, also a copy of the Civil Rights Acts that I'm going to be talking about, so that you can just keep it for your own reference. Okay. Let's begin then by talking about movement. When someone says civil rights movement, what does that mean to any of you, if anything? Or how would you, if someone says, I'm going to go join a movement, or I'm in the movement, what would that mean to you? Those of you who would mean anything. Let me say one thing about the way I have class. There's no such thing in any class that I teach as a dumb question. Okay, they're only questions. And if you got something that you really think you want to ask, don't be afraid to ask it because somebody else might think it's dumb, because they probably sit there and want to ask the same question themselves. And so the idea is to try and get it out. And if you have something to say, then say it. And then let's work off of it, okay? Because to me, that's the way you learn. You learn by expressing your ideas, and then there's give and take between you and me, and we try to come to grips with what it is between what you're saying and what I'm saying, and try and understand it, okay? So I want this to be a learning experience for you, and you ought to be comfortable enough. So if I ask questions, you don't have to have no precise answer, but just give me what you think. Anything comes to mind. So if someone says, I'm going to go join the movement, or if you said, I'm going to be in a movement, what would it mean? Yeah.
Part of the process of change.
Process of change. That's a good thought. Anything else? Anybody thinks about it? Has anyone ever heard the term?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so when you heard the term, what did you think it was?
Trying to change something.
Just try to change something, right?
Group of
So,
people working toward that change.
a group of people working towards change. Anything else?
It's like large scale.
Large scale. Anything else? Now, all 3 of those things are exactly right. Okay, in terms of a movement. Let me take those 3 things and make them maybe a little bit more precise. You have to see the civil rights movement as a protest movement. And anytime you have a protest movement, changes take place in the consciousness of people and in the behavior of people. Okay. Now, how many of you are planning on going to college here? Okay. Let me give you a secret. I taught at Marquette for 3 years. Anytime any instructor write anything on the board, write it down. Because it's like Miss Rudolph's spider that Richard Pryor talks about. You will see it again if they take the time to put it up on the board. So when you talk about a protest movement, you're talking about a change that occurs in two things: the consciousness of people and the behavior of people. And what you all were getting at relates both to the consciousness and the behavior. But let me talk first about the consciousness of people. The consciousness of people changes in three ways when you're talking about a protest movement. First of all, the system, however you're going to define that, whether you're talking about the government, whether you're talking about city, county, whether you're talking about the legal system, all of those things that make up the system, what happens is it loses its legitimacy in the minds of the people. See, when a protest movement starts, it means that people are saying, hey, this stuff that's going on, or the way that things have been going on, or the practices that have been going on, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with the laws. There's something wrong with those people who are in power, whether it's the governor or the mayor or the president or the Congress people. They messing up. So you, for the first time in the minds of the people, what you have is a situation where you question the legitimacy of the way that things are. So that's the first kind of change in the consciousness of people. The second thing is people begin to talk about rights, and this is exactly what you talked about when you said that people begin to talk about change. They begin to talk about, look, things don't have to be this way. People don't have to be poor. People don't have to be hungry. We can change that. We can have a situation where there are no women in this, or no Hispanics, or no Native Americans. We can change that. So what we're talking about then is the critical possibility of changing. And then the third part of the consciousness is that people begin to feel that they can be a part of the change. It's like being in school, being in high school, and you come into the classroom or the first day of class, or particularly when you're in the 9th grade, or when you become a fresh person in college. It's always like this feeling of helplessness. You get there and people tell you, hey, this is how things are done. And so the whole idea is that you sitting there saying, well, hey, I ain't nothing but a freshman, or I don't know, I just got here, or I don't know what's happening, I can't really change anything. And at a certain point in time, you move from feeling you can't change anything to saying, yeah, I can change something. Hey, I got an opinion, my opinion ought to be considered, and I want something done. So that what happens in a protest movement is people move to the point where they no longer feel helpless, and they actually begin to feel that people can make a difference. What do you think has been the most recent example, although it's not a protest movement, but of just the idea that people can make a difference, right?
On that USA
Sort of, but something even more directly on this point that I'm making. But I mean, that's not far afield, that's in the same arena. It's just I'm trying to look for something closer to the center circle. Coca-Cola. The whole idea that Coke said, well, hey, most people would think that, hey, if Coke say they're going to put out a new improved Coke, that's it. You can't change Coca-Cola. But all of a sudden, all these people start organizing, getting buttons, bring back Coke. And so all of a sudden, there was a change because the people who drink Coke said, hey, we can make a difference. I like the old Coke. I don't want this new stuff that's supposed to taste like Pepsi. So because people organized, they made a difference. Something that is more even in line with the notion of a social movement. Let's take when that movie came out. What was the name of it? Something about Christmas, Santa Claus or something. What was it?
Friday night dinner.
Right. And it was a woman right here in Milwaukee who said, hey, how can they have Santa Claus killing people? You know, what would my, you know, this is against everything I would believe in. Santa Claus come down the chimney and kill people. So they started a little movement, and all of a sudden, what happened? They took that movie out. I mean, all of a sudden it disappeared. Why? Because somebody said, hey, we can make a difference. So what I'm trying to get you to see is that in a protest movement, as far as the consciousness of people is concerned, these changes take place. That you question the legitimacy of what is happening and what's in power. You begin to talk about the notion of change, that things don't have to be the way that they are, and that people can make a difference. So that's the first aspect of talking about a protest movement, is the changes that takes place in the consciousness of people.
I was going to say mad. Would that be an example?
Mad is an example, or sad is an example. Students against drunk driving. So that you all can, do the same thing. I mean, you can have because you got to start feeling that. Because otherwise, what you sort of do is you sort of float along. And think about how many of us just sort of float along. You say, well, hey, they did this to us. Oh, man, yeah, I can't do nothing about it. You can't do nothing. And it's always that feeling, okay? So if for example, Lionel Richie or Michael Jackson or whoever said, well, hell, we can't do nothing about this thing in Africa, then maybe millions of dollars wouldn't have been raised. Or people felt, hey, it's too much to organize Band-Aid. You can't do that. So even though those are not protest movements, they illustrate the notion of what happens when you talk about a change in the consciousness of people. Now, the second key then is once the consciousness change, what about the behavior? See, because you have to see this as a relationship between ideas and practice. Okay? I'm sure all of you know people who got good ideas. I mean, they got ideas a minute, but they don't ever do nothing. That's all they got is ideas or mouth. So they run their mouth, but when it comes time to put whatever you talk about into practice, then they short on that question. So you talk about the change in the consciousness, and then you talk about the change in the behavior. Now, the behavior changes in a couple of ways, and this is very important. And one of the books on that list I gave you is called Poor People's Movements, Why Some Succeed and Why They Fail by Piven and Cloward. And a lot of what I'm talking about comes out here because I agree with it. They say the first thing that happens is people's behavior becomes one of defiance. Their behavior becomes one of defiance. Like, let me give you an idea. Let's assume, and none of this, of course, is true, right? But this is just for academic discussion, that you all didn't like nothing about what was going on with Upward Bound. So you got here, you didn't like the teachers, you didn't like the rules, you didn't like Marquette, you didn't like climbing up to the fourth floor, you didn't think the courses were any good, you didn't think any of the instructors were any good. I mean, it was all, and the dorm was terrible. I mean, everything you could think of was terrible, okay? So what would happen is somebody would say, man, we got to do something about this. And those people wouldn't be scared to say, yeah, well, let's have a meeting and try and, plan what we're going to do. What's happened is that, first of all, you question the legitimacy of the whole thing. Then you say, hey, we got to do something about changing this. And that, hey, we are the ones who can make a difference. But the first thing we got to do is, in terms of our behavior, we have got to defy what's now happening. Okay, so in other words, we got to take on the authority so that we have what is in essence a defiant attitude about what's going on. And so Kevin and somebody stand up and say, okay, everybody, go do what we said. And all y'all say, no, we ain't doing nothing until we get this straight, that straight, blah, blah, blah. First thing you're going to say is, what? And then it's going to be like that. You're going to say, yeah, now what you going to do? We are. Ain't none of us doing nothing. Okay? So you got to see, as that comes off, you got to see that as a defiant situation. Okay? Or say you're in school, and this, you know, this has happened. The principal decide, we calling off the homecoming dance or something. And people say, what? You can't do that. Well, I'm the principal. Then all of a sudden you all say, yeah, but we the students. And the reason why you can be a principal is because we here. If we wasn't here, what would you be the principal of? So then all of a sudden you adopt a defiant attitude, all right? So your behavior changes and it becomes defiant. The second type of change in your behavior, and someone said it, is that people working together, is that you then work in a collective fashion. You don't just operate as a group of isolated individuals. That you pull yourself into some kind of group. So that what happens then is you have a defiant attitude and your behavior reflects that defiance, and then you move in a collective fashion. You organize people together. So that when you talk about, and what this ends up being, it might end up being a march, it might end up being a rally, it might end up being people just sitting in, refusing to leave, or it might be the opposite, that everybody walk out. You know, like several years ago when they got ready to turn North Division into a citywide specialty school, and we fought it over a year. The people who started that fight were the students at North who walked out and marched down to the school board and said, we're not letting you take North Division as an attendance area school and turn it into a citywide specialty. It got started by students who took a defiant, their behavior was defiant, they organized themselves in a collective fashion. Okay? So that when you hear the term protest movement, you're talking about a movement that reflects a change in these two aspects of people's life. You know, their consciousness changes and their behavior changes. Now, the important thing to remember is that when you discuss movement, you make a distinction between movement and an organization. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, all of a sudden you all are fed up with everything in your school. And sort of out of that, you get a spontaneous thing where people say, man, we got to do something. We got to get this together. We got to do that. And so then you put together an organization. The organization may or may not reflect what initially started out in the movement. Because a lot of times, organizations get formed, and the reasons why the movement started don't always get reflected in what those organizations do. You would hope so, because you want to have a close tie between the organization and the movement, so that the goals of the movement are reflected in the organization, and that the organization operates to deal with the goals of the movement. But that doesn't always happen. Now, a lot of times, what happens is you get a contradiction. Let me try and give you an example. Are many of you familiar with the Lacy case? Okay. When Ernie Lacy was killed, spontaneously, a lot of people were concerned. And so some of us decided to put together an organization. Okay, now, the problem was that in the past, people had gotten killed, and organizations were put together, but the organizations started talking about things like, we need more black policemen, or we need police community review board. And to me, that wasn't what the movement developed was around justice for Ernie Lacy. So that Michael McGee and myself fought to make sure that the organization that got put together stayed on target. So that what we said was, what we want done is, we want the cops who murdered him, we want them, first of all, suspended, fired, and then we want them convicted of murder. How does the fact that you get 2 more black policemen do anything about the fact that Ernie Lacy got murdered like a dog down on 23rd and Wisconsin Avenue? What's the relationship? See, but what happens is a lot of times people's anger and all of this stuff happens, and they come out, and then here comes some people, who are going to be in the leadership, and they put together an organization, and they got some things they want to get done, and they use, the movement to put forth their thing, even though their thing may not be connected at all, to what the whole movement started about. So that's something as we go along you need to watch.
Well, can't that be good in some cases? Like an incident happens and it sparks all kinds of reform and improvement.
But see, the issue is whether or not the reform and improvement is related to what is the problem. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you take the Lacy case, the fact that you get more black policemen don't deal with the fact that Ernie Lacy was murdered. Now, if what happens is those cops are disciplined, that then sends a message that, hey, you can't be jumping out of cars, grabbing people, throwing them down on the sidewalk, putting your knee on the back of their neck, and so forth. So that the idea, though, is to make sure that the reform or the changes relate to the problem. But because I've been sitting back all my life saying, hey, we need to have a police community review board, that's not necessarily speaking to the issue that caused this whole thing to develop. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have black police on the south side and all that. That's all fine. But how does that relate to justice for Ernie Lacy? You see, what happens is a lot of people get turned off because they come out into the streets and they're angry about a particular thing. And then when the deal go down, the thing that they came out about, don't nothing happen with that. But then some other stuff happen over here and everybody tell you, hey, we got a victory. And you be trying to understand, how can that be? What victory? Nothing happened to the people who killed them. The city didn't have to pay nothing. There were no changes in the regulations. So that's what we went after, to try and keep the goals of the organization that came together tied in with the movement that developed. Questions about either the definition or anything else of that stuff? Was that clear? Sure. Okay, let's then move to talk about the civil rights movement. Okay, so now we have a general concept of movement. Now what we want to do is to say, yeah, but what about the civil rights movement? Because that's a particular social movement or protest movement. Let me give you a definition of civil rights. Civil rights are politically defined freedoms. Civil rights are politically defined freedoms and laws that stipulate. Civil rights are politically defined freedoms, and what will they say, based on laws. Politically defined freedoms based on laws that stipulate what people can do to fully participate in the society. Civil rights are politically defined freedoms based on laws that stipulate or tell you what people as groups or as individuals can do to fully participate in the society. That's what we mean by civil rights. Now, the civil rights movement then both in principle and practice. A fight for just laws, both in principle and in practice, that was going to make it possible for all people to fully participate in the society. So just think about it for a minute. It was a fight for just laws and practices so that all of the people who live in the society could fully participate. Because the notion of the civil rights movement was that black people were not being allowed to fully participate in the society. So that the civil rights movement then was this fight for just laws. Some people call it the struggle for democratic rights. The struggle for democratic rights. And that these rights were guaranteed by the Constitution. So it was a struggle for democratic rights that were guaranteed by the Constitution. Yes.
Could you go over the 9 o'clock of civil rights?
Yeah. It was a fight for just laws, not just have them on the books. You know, those are laws. When you hear somebody say laws in principle, they're saying, yeah, they're on the books. But the question is, what about the practice? So you wanted to have them both in principle and in practice, okay? So that all of the people could fully participate in the society. So that the way you would call it would be a fight for democratic rights. And these democratic rights are guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Everybody clear on that? Okay. The second thing then, this is what it was a fight for. It was a fight against, quote, second-class citizenship. In other words, it was a fight against the idea that whites could have certain types of freedoms and that black people couldn't have. Now, let me tell you a personal experience, okay? So, because you all are I have to keep remembering, you are so young that some of the stuff I'm going to tell you about, unless your parents or your grandparents, for many of you, told you about you guys, there's no way you would know or read it in a book. I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and a lot of your, let's see, how old are you? So you're older than my daughter. Yeah, well, some of your parents, and maybe some of your grandparents, were not born in Milwaukee. Okay? A lot of Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, blacks I'm talking about again. Okay, now, at a certain point in time, like, I spent the first 6 years of my life in Louisiana living with my grandmother, because my mother and my stepfather came up here and they left me down there. So when I finally came up here, I used to always go back to visit my grandmother. You know, every summer, there used to be this exodus of a lot of us going back down south to visit our grandparents, okay, for the summer. Now, I can remember when I was a little boy, my grandmother used to take me to the store, like a Kohl's, then I don't know, a Kohl's, Target, something, Gumbels, something. I don't know. So, you know, they had these bubblers, you know, water fountains. They had one for the colored and one for the white. And I used to ask my grandmother, you know, because, you know, you'd be headed, I was headed for the bubbler. So, well, you can't go to that one right there. And I said, well, how come? Well, you know, that's for whites. Well, I said, does it mean colored water come out of this other one? I mean, I couldn't, you know what I'm saying? I was too young to grasp what the deal was, all right? Well, the deal was that white people and black people couldn't drink out of the same water fountain. Okay, you want to go to the movies? Just like, say, the center downtown, or whatever they call them now, Riverside, whatever. When I was growing up in Milwaukee, some of those theaters had a balcony. because we, you know, if you're gonna go up in the balcony, you know, just pretending you was going to the movie, but, you know, you was going up there to try to do whatever. But most of the time it was whatever. We didn't know what else we were doing. But anyway, you know, down south, you know, during that period, if you were black and you wanted to go to the movie downtown, you couldn't go in the front. They had this little door around to the back. So you'd have to go around to the back and there'd be a sign up there, colored entrance. And the colored entrance led to the balcony. So we was always in the balcony. Because black people, white people couldn't sit together in the movie theater. And I told this story and the newspapers criticized me and screamed at me for telling it, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. You know, we used to be mad. You know, I mean, we was always mad about it. Although I didn't fully understand it, I was just mad. Because how come we gotta go back here? You know, because be dingy back there, and I wanted to go in with, you know, you'd see the people going into the front part. I wanted to go in there. No, you can't go in there. So we used to urinate in balloons and throw them down there on people, you know, just, I mean, I know that was a terrible thing to do, but, that was our defiant behavior, you know. But, you have to think about that. Or when you got on the bus, you had to go to the back of the bus. They had a line drawn right in the middle of the bus. And when black folks got on, you had to go back there and sit. And in fact, when we talk about Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, that's how the whole thing started. And what would happen is, it's really interesting, the line moved if more white people got on the bus. In other words, they had the line there, but suppose the bus got real crowded with whites. Well, blacks had to get up out of their seat, even though they was behind the line, and keep going back so whites could sit down, right? So I'm trying to give you a picture. You know, people talk about apartheid in South Africa. You had petty apartheid in America. And I'm not talking about hundreds of years ago. I'm talking about like in the 1950s, 30 years ago, which is not a long time in any history of any country. So we're not talking about hundreds of years ago. And I'm talking about stuff I know from my own experience. Okay. So the whole fight around civil rights was a fight to end this whole idea of you being second-class citizens. Black people would go to vote, go to register to vote. They asked people to recite the Constitution. And the people who were registered couldn't read themselves and wouldn't know if you recited it right. So if you even mumbled something, they'd give you something else. Because they didn't know if that was right or not. As a way to keep black people from voting. They would move the polling places. You know, they'd send you a slip, say the voting will be at 12th and Monarchy. You get the 12th and Monarchy, the voting was down on 6th and Walnut. I mean, as an example. Okay? This is what, it was like. There were white schools and black schools. And, we need to talk about that because some of what we've done to change that has messed us up more. In some ways, it would have been better if some of that hadn't been changed. But anyway, you couldn't go to white schools. You were denied the right to do that. You couldn't go and sit down at a lunch counter. I mean, the whole sin movement that we're going to talk about started at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I spent 3 years of my life, where my children are, live now. And every time I go back down to Greensboro to see them, I go to Woolworth's just to sit there and order a punch. Because there was a period of time when you couldn't sit in a lunch counter. You couldn't go into the Howard Johnson's. You couldn't go to the Holiday Inn. Say if there would be times like when we get ready to go to visit my grandmother, and I had some cousins in Chicago. So it was about a 16-hour ride, okay? Hey, you packed the chicken and the sodas and everything. because you did not stop when you got down, when you started getting past St. Louis. Hey, you wanted to keep riding. Wasn't no such thing, hey, we tired, let's check into a motel. Wasn't no such thing even as stopping in a service station saying, can I use the bathroom? If you went alongside the road, okay, you didn't step up in no cafe talking about give me a Big Mac. You know, you took your chicken with you and the chicken bones, you threw them out the window as you was eating the chicken bones. So this is what I'm talking about, all right? So this fight was for very basic things like that. The right to drink out of the same bubbler as white people. The right to go in the same door to go to the movie. The right to sit anywhere you wanted to sit on the bus. And this is 1985, and I guarantee you right now, I can take you down to places in Mississippi and North Carolina where you wouldn't go in the place to be served, okay? Because you know better. And even though we ain't moved nowhere, I'm telling you. There are places in Chicago, Cicero, that, hey, you don't be going. When I was growing up in Milwaukee, the only time I ever went across the viaduct was if I was lost. You hear me? Well, I mean, you didn't go over there. To the south side, you didn't go over there. This is in the north. So, but I'm telling you that in the south, these were laws that were set up, not just custom, but laws, exclusively to keep people divided. When I was 9 years old, I think it was 9 or 7, I don't know, 6, I don't know what I was. Maybe I was 5. I don't know. I'm sure how old I was, I can't remember. But I used to come, now I had to be less than 7. And I used to ride the train by myself to come up here to visit my mother. And when you got on the train in Louisiana, they had for blacks, you know, certain cars for blacks, and be all hot and stuff. And it is only after you got to Kansas City and change on your way to Chicago could you sit with whites on the train. So this is what I'm talking about, right? So the civil rights struggle was to change that. Now, any questions? Any questions? Okay. Now, the one thing I said in giving you the definition, I said that civil rights involve laws, right? The whole idea is based on laws. And I said that it was a fight for the guarantees of the Constitution. Well, the civil rights movement that we're going to be talking about, which is basically the civil rights, which is the movement between 1954, now why would you pick 54? Anybody got a guess? Anything significant happened in 1954? Huh? That was in 55. 54. Thank all of you all who go to, who live in North Division's attendance area and go to Vincent or Pulaski or Marshall or Hamilton. Right, Brown decision in 1954. Okay, so 1954 to roughly, I'd say 1969, 70. That's the period of time that I would say is what you would call the modern day civil rights movement that we're going to be talking about. Now, that civil rights movement, based again on laws and the whole Constitution, that there are two specific aspects of the Constitution that were used as a basis for the civil rights movement, and I want to talk about it because I want you to know what these are. The Bill of Rights. Anybody know what the Bill of Rights is? Huh? Okay. And then the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. 13th, 14th, and 15th. And the Bill of Rights, right? Okay, now, the Bill of Rights, which were ratified in 1791, which is exactly as you said, those amendments. Let me talk about what some of them were. talked about the rights of people, but they were very careful to avoid mentioning black people, slavery, or women. Okay? So that in fact, even though these amendments were made, they were made at the point in history that the United States still has slavery. So that all of this good stuff that was in the Bill of Rights didn't apply to black people or women. Okay? So they talked about things like, first of all, number one, the federal government was not allowed to interfere with the free exercise of religion, speech, the press, the right of assembly. So you hear people, for example, who will say, this isn't an infringement on my First Amendment rights. Have you ever heard that terminology? It's like in the argument about whether or not you can have Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler, whatever, or people say they wanted to write something in a newspaper, and the newspaper said, no, you can't put it in there. And people say that that is an infringement on my First Amendment rights. That's what they're talking about from the Bill of Rights that talks about you prohibited from interfering with the free exercise of religion. That's what the whole thing about the Moonies is all about. You know, where Song Young Moon says that he's, religious, and that what you're talking about is interfering with the rights of religion. First Amendment right. Okay? Second one was talking about, and you hear people talk about this now with the gun laws, the United States guaranteed people the right to keep and bear arms. That's a big issue. So that when people start talking about changing gun control laws, you got all these National Rifle Association people and lobbyists who come out, and they all come out on the basis of their Second Amendment rights to bear arms. Yes.
Isn't that leaving part of that amendment out? Isn't it something like isn't that geared to like a state or a National Guard?
No, it is geared to the, in fact, that's what is specific, that individuals have the right to bear arms. Very specific. The third thing is, it's not important, so forget it, but during the war, there were some restrictions placed on you're having to keep soldiers in your house. I mean, that's good. But the fourth one is another one that comes up, and that's the guarantee against any kind of unreasonable search and seizure. So that this whole idea that cops can stop you, or people can just run into your house and search your house without a warrant, search warrant, and all that, that you can trace back to the Fourth Amendment. Yes.
At school, they said they can search you any place, anytime, anywhere.
And this is why they get sued, because people sue them, and there have been suits on that basis as to whether or not that can be done. Now, what happens is there's certain, how can I put it, over the years, guidelines that are laid out that are supposed to keep people consistent with this. But if lawyers are arguing all the time that say if people went into your locker to search for drugs, they've got to have some basis for doing that, or else you can sue them.
Yeah, all they go by is suspicion.
Yeah, but see, what I'm trying to argue is that people can do anything until you sue their behinds. Okay? And so, they may do it figuring that they tell you, hey, I can do it, and you be scared. You go home and get a lawyer, the possibility is that you could win a suit, depending on the circumstances. Well, yeah. Well, but even if they find something, there have been cases thrown out of court because they unlawfully searched.
What about polygraph tests?
That's a different issue. Okay? And actually, can nobody force you to take a polygraph test? That's something you can say yeah or nay to. So that was the fourth one. The fifth one, and the sixth one, and the seventh one, and the eighth one, all sort of related to the process of fair trial and due process of law. You know, where they're saying that they can't just hold you unless they got a reason. This whole idea of double jeopardy, you know, where they try you for a crime, they find you innocent, they can't try you for that same crime again. It's called double jeopardy. That stuff is included in like the Fifth Amendment. The sixth is the right to a speedy trial. You know, and see, some of this stuff gets lost again. I mean, what is speedy? There's 2 years speedy. I mean, they got people, huh?
Is it like 6 months they have to do something with you? You can't just sit in jail?
See, it's different. It's not consistently applied from state to state, which is interesting because the definition of speedy varies. Okay, so all the amendments say is you got to have a speedy trial. The right of a trial by jury, although there are now exceptions, but everyone is supposed to have the ability to demand a trial by jury within certain exceptions. Another really important one, the death penalty, because the Eighth Amendment says that you cannot be involved with cruel and unusual punishment. So all of these struggles against the death penalty was based on whether or not the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. So those are like just some of the 10 amendments that he mentioned that are called the Bill of Rights. Now, what is the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution? Give me 13.
Declare the slaves.
No, outlawed slavery. Right. Outlawed slavery. That slavery nor involuntary servitude could be used except as punishment for a crime. So the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery. Do you know what Juneteenth is? Do you? What is it? I mean, other than people walk up and down 3rd Street. Huh?
Isn't that the black people Independence Day?
But Independence Day, how?
That's what
Well, no, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just telling you to talk some more about what do you mean Independence Day? I thought July 4th was Independence Day.
No,
Black people. Independence from what? Slavery. Yeah, that's really what it was. But it was, so you know exactly what it was. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, they didn't have videos, you know, they didn't have MTV and cable. So it took a long time for the message to get around to folks, okay? So it was like Juneteenth by the time the message got to Oklahoma, where there was a lot of black towns. And so people started celebrating that day as the Juneteenth Day, or the day that the slaves were freed. Even though it had happened in an earlier period, it just took a long time for the message to get around. So that's what that is. Okay, who knows what the 14th Amendment is? Yep,
Is it to free all slaves?
that was the 13th. What's the 14th?
Is it the right to vote for black people to vote?
No, that's the 15th. What's the 14th? What's the 14th?
Did they make the black people citizens of the United States?
Yeah, all people born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. Naturalized? A naturalized citizen is someone who was born somewhere else, but meets whatever are the stipulations for you to become a naturalized citizen of the United States, where you take the oath and, you know, and whatever else you have to do. Now, once a person, see, this was meant really, it wasn't just for, it was for slaves, but there were also, during various periods of time, when a lot of immigration had occurred, you know, in American society, and not just non-white immigrants. I mean, Milwaukee is a case example of immigrants. I mean, think about the Polish communities, the German communities. If you study the history of Wisconsin, you know, in the earlier period, and then later on with Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, and now with various, you know, whether we're talking about Laotians or Hmong or Cambodians, and so we, you know, this is the way the United States has been. So the interesting thing about the United States is the only people who are from here are Native Americans, Indians.
Yeah.
Think about it. I mean, Columbus said he discovered America, he thought he was Indian, as you recall. So that's how Indians got the name Indians, was on the basis of when Columbus got here, he thought he was an Indian. But see, the issue is, he said he discovered it. How can you discover something if there's some people here when you got here? You know what I mean? I mean, what do you mean you discovered it? They discovered it. They was here when you got here. Okay. So, I mean, just think about that for a minute, right? I mean, it's true. So, but everybody else didn't come from here no way. Okay, so that was the importance of the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, states were forbidden to deny suffrage or to vote to any citizen because of race or color. Interesting enough, this is in 1870, they didn't say nothing about gender. Because women were denied the right to vote until the 20s, or yeah, I think it was in the 1920s. Okay, so when you talk about then the civil rights movement, and you talk about, well, what laws were the basis for this civil rights movement that we're talking about, the laws that were the basis were the U.S. Constitution, and specifically, the Bill of Rights and the 14th, 15th, and 16th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, okay? Now, let me you're supposed to hold up 3 minutes. No. Why don't we take a break and people will be back here. Let me see, were there any questions from the stuff that I just covered? Because I'm getting ready to move to a different area. Are there any questions?
I hear some people say they approve the Fifth Amendment, so you don't have to say nothing on the grounds of incriminating.
Like incriminating, right? Right. That's it's in that same Bill of Rights. So, you know, you hear people plead the Fifth, that's what it is. Now, one of the things that I found interesting is that in my whole time throughout high school, I never read the Constitution. And they've got some little booklets out, and I've got one at home that I'll bring to show you on Wednesday. You might just get it, because it's an interesting thing to go through, you know, trying to figure out, hey, what am I supposed to have around here? A lot of people never read it, don't know what it's about, so I would suggest you take a look at it. And there's a really good books sort of detailing where all of these different amendments came from, why they were the way that they were, and so forth. Okay, let me move on, and if there's not any more questions. I want to talk about now, whenever you talk about the movement, you all see me wince, I'm sorry, I have a bad back, I should be in bed. But there's the issue of the difference between strategy and tactics in a movement. And it's very important to understand the difference, because I want to talk about what tactics were important and what was the strategy for the civil rights movement. Now, whenever you see someone say, what's your strategy? What they're talking about, or ought to be talking about, is the long-range goal. In other words, a strategy is a long-range goal that, you know, the movement should fight for. The long-range goal that the movement should fight for at a particular time to achieve its main objective. The long-range goal that the movement should fight for at a particular stage in time to achieve its main objective. Now let me use the civil rights movement as an example, and stop me if this is not clear, because I've trained people over years, and very few people know You need a pen?
No.
Oh, I thought one of y'all didn't have a pen. Give my pen back then.
Go paragraph.
Yeah, right. Okay, if you take the civil rights movement, the objective of the civil rights movement is what, based on what we just talked about? What did I say the objective was? To achieve what?
Stop second class citizens.
Right, that's right. In essence, to achieve democratic rights. So that's really the objective. So that to achieve democratic rights guaranteed by the Constitution, which meant the right to vote, the right not to be discriminated against in a public place. So in fact, you could sit on a toilet next to a white person or drink out of the bubbler or whatever. Ended any kind of discrimination in employment. So that's really what the objective was of the civil rights movement. Now, the strategy was to do things to force the system to respond to the demands of the movement so that that objective could be reached. So that the strategy was to get changes in the laws, to get changes in the behavior, to try and get affirmative action. That was the strategy. But the objective of getting the changes in the laws was so that people would not be discriminated against. So that's what is meant by the strategy. It is the formulation of the, quote, long-range goal. And it's really relatively speaking, because it's long-range at a particular point in time to reach a specific objective. Yes.
I guess is the strategy like a set of logical steps that you're gonna take?
Well, see, really, let me talk about tactics for a minute, and then let's come back and see if you're still confused, because I can understand. I was confused about it for only 15 years. And I think I'm just now beginning to understand it. But let me talk about tactics for a moment. Tactics are the activities of the movement on a day-to-day basis. Okay? So if someone says, well, what tactics are we going to use? The tactics are the things that you use to get a change in the laws or to get a change in the behavior so that you can reach the objective of getting democratic rights. So what you might do is you might compromise on tactics, and I'll tell you what some of them are. Like this tactic might be better than the other tactic, but you don't compromise on that. What you're trying to do is to get changes in the laws or to force the system to respond so that you can reach the objective. So when people talk about tactics in the civil rights movement, there were three main tactics that were used. Legal tactics, and amongst those were like injunctions, like they would try and get an injunction against someone denying black people the right to get an order a meal at a lunch counter. So you go into the court to try and get an injunction. Or you may sue. That's what the Brown decision was. It was a suit by a number of parents, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Or you might defend black people in court. Like, for example, the Scottsboro case is something that you all might want to read. And a more recent example were these three or four people down in Selma, Alabama, who were allegedly charged with voter fraud, that they were supposed to have been registering people who weren't really there or whatever. And so a part of the whole legal struggle of civil rights was to go to court to, in fact, defend blacks against all kinds of stuff that people would bring down. So the legal tactic of seeking injunctions, suing, defending people in court, that was one tactic. A second tactic was mass actions. Mass actions. And those were boycotts, sit-ins. Everyone know what a sit-in is? Anybody not know what a sit-in is? You just go sit in. In fact, during the Lacey case, we used sit-ins, but we brought a new element to it. Usually what happens is when people go sit in, everybody's real somber. Like the first time I got put in jail, it was in a sit-in in Cleveland. We had sat in all night at the school board building. And the cops came in the next day, and we were blocking the entrance so people couldn't get to work. So the cops came in, threw us down 4 flights of steps. They had a gauntlet, people on both sides of the steps with clubs. They were beating us as we were rolling down the steps. And so, sit-ins. But the difference that we brought in the Lacey thing was instead of being somber and everything, we brought music down there. And when we sat in the DA's office and we played cards, people started bringing greens and stuff. So that was our whole way of a new introduction, a new element into the sit-in. But sit-ins, marches, picketing, strikes, and then any of these can be done in such a way that they mean civil disobedience. The civil disobedience is when you consciously go out to break a law through one of these mass actions, knowing that you're going to get arrested. But mass actions of various types like these were another tactic. The third tactic was electoral politics. And that involved voter registration drives, get out the vote efforts, running people for office, get out the vote, voter registration drives, and what's called block voting and bullet voting. Do y'all know what that is? Okay. Bullet voting, block voting is very simple. Now what you try to do is get all, say, black people during the civil rights movement to all vote together. Okay. And bullet voting is, let's say you've got 6 people running for 3 seats, say on the school board. And so if you go to vote, you could actually vote for 3 people. But let's say that of the 6 people, you got 1 black person running. What bullet voting is that instead of black people voting for all 3 people, you only vote for 1. You just vote for the 1 person that's running. And what that means, of course, is that instead of you giving 2 additional votes to whatever 2 people, you're only going to vote for that 1 person. So the other people are going in, and they might vote for your person as well, but they're going to vote for the other 2 people. So what you're doing is giving your vote to the person that you for and taking your vote away from 2 other people. Y'all understand that? To try and increase the number of votes. So it's called bullet voting or single votes. It's used in different names. So the 3 major tactics were legal, mass actions, and electoral politics. Now, let's go back to your question about strategy and tactics.
I don't know, I was sort of confused on the strategy. You talked about a long-range goal for strategy. I thought a strategy was a method of thinking.
Well, see, that's why I'm saying that there's confusion. Really, tactics are the specific things that you do to implement your strategy. Your strategy involves you're setting a long-range goal that you're trying to reach to get you to an objective. And most people confuse strategy and tactics. They'll say, well, what's your strategy? And you'll say, we're going to go downtown and picket in front of Gimbel's. Well, that's not really your strategy. That's a tactic. The strategy is the long-range goal that those tactics are supposed to get you to. And the purpose of the long-range goal is for you to reach an objective. So just keep trying to play with it in your mind. The specific things that you do on a day-to-day basis are not strategy. Those are tactics. And see, people compromise on tactics, but not on strategy. But if you confuse them, you don't know what you're doing. And a lot of movements fail because people don't know the difference between strategy and tactics. You have a question?
I was just going to point out
It is the plan, which is in essence a goal that guides, that's supposed to guide the specific actions, which are tactics. But even, see, the plan though has to have at the end of it an objective. You develop a strategy to reach an objective. You use tactics to implement the strategy. Okay, and so the civil rights movement essentially had these three groupings of tactics that they used. And you notice I left out violence because violence was not a tactic of the civil rights movement. That came in the Black Power movement, okay, that I'll talk about. Okay, any questions about those? All right, if you think about this between now and Wednesday and it's still confusing, raise it in the beginning on Wednesday. Pardon me?
You're not coming to
No, it'll be Wednesday. Okay, and any stuff that we talked about, if you all go back and talk about it amongst yourself and you got questions about it, before we start anything new on Wednesday, let's talk about questions that you have, okay? Now, let me try and give you some key developments in the civil rights movement. These are things that were very important during that period that I have up there on the board, 1954 to 1968. The first one is Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. That's the Brown decision on school desegregation. Most people don't know that there were two Browns. There was Brown 1 and Brown 2. Brown 1 was in 1954. Brown 2 was 1955. What we're talking about is Brown 1 declared that separate but equal was inherently unequal, and that the separation of black children because of their race generated a feeling of inferiority and all that. In other words, Brown 1 said that the segregation of white and black children in state public schools solely on the basis of race denied to black children the equal protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So it was an equal protection question. So just remember, equal protection. Brown 2 in 1955 was when the Supreme Court came back and said, now that we said that, this is how you're supposed to implement it. And that's when the quote that some of you may have heard about you're supposed to integrate with all deliberate speed, that came up in Brown 2. So there were two Brown decisions.
What happened to Brown?
That was, here's what we said is wrong. Now here's how you're supposed to implement the changes in order to deal with what we said was wrong. So there was a decision on, hey, this is wrong, and then there was another decision on how you're supposed to go about changing what was wrong. And so those were a year apart. Most people don't ever talk about it in that way. But it was Brown 1 and Brown 2. The other thing to remember, and this is not important, but this is just when you want to make some money on somebody. You know, when you know something they don't know, is that the Brown decision was really made up of 4 different cases. See, most people see Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, but really the Brown decision involved a case from South Carolina, a case from Virginia, and a case from Delaware, along with the case from Kansas. And they just simply, since they were all about the same thing, they got folded in to one decision, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. Delaware, South Carolina, and Virginia, along with Kansas. So that those were all folded in to the Brown decision. Okay, so that was 1954, 1955. The second development that I want you to be aware of is the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was when? 55. Now, what happened with how did the Montgomery bus boycott come about? Rosa Parks, right? She said her feet hurt, she was tired. And remember I told you about the line in the bus? She said she wasn't getting up. So she was arrested. And then now what's important to remember, they never tell you about it in a lot of cases, that there was a young black teenager that was arrested the day before or the week before. So that wasn't, and so Rosa Parks was like the second person to do it, except maybe because of who she was or the conditions or whatever. That really sparked then a movement that became known as the Montgomery bus boycott. And who was the leader of that movement? Martin Luther King Jr. That's when Martin Luther King first began to come into prominence because they had the meeting at the church, and he was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. The Montgomery Improvement Association. And the Montgomery Improvement Association led the boycott for a year. And exactly 1 year from the date that they began, the Montgomery bus company integrated its buses. So people walked, people rode cabs, carpools for a year. And it was 1 year later that the bus company integrated. So the Montgomery bus boycott. The third development that's important for you to remember are the student sit-ins. Student sit-ins. And this is important because you all need to understand that it was people your age that changed the course of history in the United States as far as race relations. You hear about Martin Luther King and everything, but you gotta remember it was the student sit-in movement that really was the key to a lot of the things that occurred because the students were a much more militant group. And anyone know when the student sit-in movement began and where it began? 4 black students from North Carolina A&T University, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina, walked in to a Woolworths on February the 1st, 1960. And they sat down at the lunch counter from North Carolina A&T. It's a black school. Well, now all of the black schools are part of the North Carolina system. But they used to have schools like North Carolina College for colored people. Then it became North Carolina College, then it became North Carolina Central University. North Carolina A&T means North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College. Yeah, in Greensboro. February 1, 1960. Okay. And that started the sit-in movements that spread all over the country. Because once they started doing it in Greensboro, they started doing it everywhere.
And they just sat down?
Just sat down and waited for people to come and take their order. And what they did, the first day was to close the lunch counter. Second day they came back in and sat down. The police came and arrested them. And then people started coming. And then Julian Bond down in Nashville, it was in Nashville, got involved, or Atlanta, one of them. And then people started sitting in all over the South, sitting in. That's how it started. Now, Jesse Jackson got his start in that Jesse was good looking and could speak. So these people got Jesse to speak for the sit-in movement that started. Jesse didn't do nothing. in the beginning, okay? He was just fine and could speak. So they needed somebody fine and could speak. So that's how Jesse got his start. So just a little sidelight I thought you might want to. Okay, so the student sit-in movement. The fourth thing was the Freedom Rides. Have you ever heard of the Freedom Rides?
Yep.
Okay, what was that about? Huh? You asking me? Anybody know what they were?
Wasn't that something like a bunch of people, like from New York especially, would all load up into a bus and go down and try to help, stop the segregation on, I don't know.
On the buses, right. So what would happen is it first got started when James Farmer, who was the head of CORE, and I'm going to tell you who all these organizations are in a moment or the next time. They left Washington, D.C. by a bus May 4th, 1961. And what they were going to do was they got on the Greyhound, and they were not, see, the tradition was you could start out sitting anywhere, but once you got below the Mason-Dixie line, which was like past St. Louis or past Missouri, then black people had to get to the back of the bus. But what the Freedom Riders did was black and white, it's very important you understand that. These weren't just black people, black and white people who got on these buses, and they refused to move to the back of the bus. And the whites who were on the Freedom Ride refused to come to the front of the bus. So on May the 14th, 1961, a mob greeted a Freedom Ride bus right outside of Anniston, Alabama. And people were beaten, seriously pulled off the bus and really beaten very badly. But the whole idea of the Freedom Rides was to begin to attack the issue of segregation on the buses and segregation in the terminals. On May the 20th, a group of Freedom Riders who were in the Montgomery, Alabama terminals were beaten. So this was very dangerous. All of this stuff was dangerous, but the Freedom Rides, people were beaten very severely. Pardon me? What year? It started in 1961 was really the first one of the Freedom Rides. The fifth one is the March on Washington, August 28, 1963. Now they just recently had the, what was it? What I want to say? The 20th anniversary of the March on Washington was in '83. August 28, 1963. That was when Martin Luther King gave the famous I Have a Dream speech, and over 250,000 people marched to Washington, D.C., which was the largest civil rights demonstration in history. A sixth development was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. That was in 1963 in September. 4 black girls were killed in that bombing in Alabama. September of 1963. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The seventh event, that again is very important for people your age, was the Freedom Summer of 1964. The Freedom Summer of 1964. And that's when hundreds of student volunteers, white and black, mostly from the north, went to Mississippi to work in what was called the Summer Project. The Summer Project. And it was organized by 4 civil rights organizations, SNCC, CORE, NAACP, and SCLC. I'll come back to those. Now, the important thing to remember about the Freedom Summer of 1964, how many of you have ever heard of Goodman, Schorner, and Cheney? These were 3 young civil rights workers, 2 white, 1 black, that were killed by the Klan for being involved in the Summer Project. And their bodies were buried in a dam. And there was a big uproar. I can remember it like it was yesterday, because they disappeared and no one could find them. And it was 6 weeks later that they were found in a dam. Well, it was many, many years later before anybody was ever tried. And the Klan did it, but the sheriff in the county was the Klan. And so they were all involved in killing these 3 civil rights workers. And there's a song that was out, but I'm trying to remember whether or not you would have ever heard it. Because they talked about Goodman and Schorner and Cheney. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schorner, S-C-H-W-E-R-N-E-R, and James Cheney. Cheney was the black person, the other 2 were white. Okay. The 8th event was the Selma March. The Selma March in 1965. And on March 7, 1965 is what was known as Bloody Sunday. And there are films, and if we had time, if I was teaching this course the whole year, I would show you films of people marching to this bridge. and there was this Breyer, Chief Breyer type individual called Bull Connor. And what they did was they met these people at the bridge coming into Selma, and they rolled them down with horses, beat them with nightsticks. They turned dogs on them. I mean, all of this took place on what was called Bloody Sunday. And it led to a big national uprising, because all of a sudden people saw this stuff on TV. And on March 21st to the 25th, Dr. King led a new march from Selma to Montgomery. And it was during this march, in the aftermath, that a white woman named Viola Liuzzo, I can never pronounce her name, Liuzzo, was shot to death by night riders. And that was a big case. And just recently, her family finally got some redress from the government, and this happened in 1965, 20 years ago. And yeah, what happened was, the reason why she was killed is she was riding in a car with a black man. And night riders is what they were called. You know, they spotted him, and they pulled up next to him, and they shot and killed him. And the interesting thing was, an FBI informant who worked for the FBI was in the car. And there's some question, you know, throughout history as to whether or not he pulled the trigger. And he was working for the FBI.
He didn't get shot?
No, he wasn't in, I'm not in the car with her. In the car with the people who shot him. Name was Gary Rowe. Okay, so the Selma March. Now, one last thing. Out of all of these things that happened, and there were many, many more, but I just picked out some highlights. What I'm going to bring to you are the Civil Rights Bills of 1960, 1964, and 1968. The Civil Rights Bills of 1960, 1964, and 1968. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was a direct result of the Selma March. The other civil rights bills were the result of other activities that took place during the civil rights movement. So when we get together next time, I'm going to go briefly over what those civil rights bills did, and we're going to go from there to talk about the 5 major organizations in the civil rights movement.